The shadows of criminal history hold secrets that most people never hear about. While names like Ted Bundy and Jeffrey Dahmer dominate headlines and documentaries, there exists a darker realm of killers whose crimes were equally heinous, yet somehow slipped through the cracks of public consciousness. Today, we're pulling back the curtain on 5 serial killers whose stories will chill you to the bone, yet whose names you've likely never heard whispered in the same breath as the more infamous monsters of our time. These aren't the killers who captured media attention or spawned countless books and movies. These are the predators who operated in the margins, targeting society's most vulnerable, leaving trails of devastation that law enforcement struggled to piece together. Their victims were often the forgotten, the overlooked, the people whose disappearances didn't immediately raise alarms. And perhaps that's exactly why these killers were able to continue their reigns of terror for far longer than they should have. What makes these cases particularly disturbing isn't just the brutality of their crimes, but the calculated precision with which they operated. These weren't crimes of passion or momentary madness. These were methodical, ritualistic acts carried out by individuals who had perfected their craft through repetition and refinement. They understood human psychology well enough to exploit it. They knew how to select victims who wouldn't be missed quickly, and they had developed systems for disposal that allowed them to remain undetected. The first name on our list might sound unfamiliar, but Dennis Nilsen's crimes in London during the late 1970s and early 1980s represent one of the most disturbing cases of serial murder in British history. Unlike the flashy killers who courted publicity, Nilsen operated with a quiet efficiency that allowed him to claim at least 12 lives before a simple plumbing problem brought his world crashing down. Born in Scotland in 1945, Dennis Andrew Nilsen grew up in a fractured household that left deep psychological scars. His father abandoned the family when Dennis was young, leaving him to be raised by his mother and maternal grandfather. The death of his beloved grandfather when Nilsen was just 6 years old marked a turning point in his psychological development. He later described being deeply disturbed by seeing his grandfather's corpse, an image that would haunt him and potentially contribute to his later necrophilic tendencies. After a stint in the military and police force, Nilsen found himself living alone in London, working as a civil servant and struggling with his homosexuality in an era when it was still largely taboo. His isolation and internal conflicts created a perfect storm of psychological dysfunction that would eventually manifest in the most horrific ways imaginable. Nilsen's method was deceptively simple yet devastatingly effective. He would frequent pubs and bars in London, particularly those known to attract young gay men, homeless individuals, and social outcasts. With his mild manner and apparent respectability, he could easily strike up conversations with lonely, vulnerable people who were grateful for human connection. He would invite them back to his flat for drinks, presenting himself as a sympathetic ear or a potential romantic interest. Once his victims were in his home, usually intoxicated and relaxed, Nilsen would strike. His preferred method was strangulation, sometimes combined with drowning in his bathtub. He would watch the life drain from their eyes, experiencing what he later described as a profound sense of power and control. But for Nilsen, the killing was only the beginning of his twisted ritual. What set Nilsen apart from many other serial killers was his post-mortem behavior. Rather than immediately disposing of the bodies, he would keep them for days, sometimes weeks. He would bathe the corpses, dress them in clean clothes, and arrange them in lifelike positions around his flat. He would talk to them, watch television with them, and then even sleep next to them. This necrophilic relationship satisfied his desperate need for companionship while maintaining the absolute control that the living could never provide. When the bodies began to decompose, Nilsen would dismember them with clinical precision. He had developed an efficient system for disposal that involved burning remains in bonfires in his garden, telling neighbors that he was simply burning garbage. The acrid smell that occasionally wafted through the neighborhood was explained away as nothing more than typical household waste disposal. For years, this system worked perfectly. Nilsen's victims were primarily individuals from marginalized communities whose disappearances weren't immediately investigated. Many were homeless, estranged from their families, or living on the fringes of society. Some had fled the troubled homes and weren't reported missing. Others were assumed to have simply moved on, as transient people often do. This tragic reality allowed Nilsen to continue his killing spree undetected. The psychological profile that emerged from later analysis revealed a man driven by an overwhelming fear of abandonment, combined with an insatiable need for control. His victims represented the ideal companions. They couldn't leave him, couldn't reject him, and couldn't judge him. In death, they provided the unconditional presence that had been absent from his life since childhood. Nilsen's carefully constructed world began to unravel when he moved to a new flat that lacked the garden space necessary for his disposal method. Forced to adapt, he began dismembering bodies and flushing smaller pieces down the toilet and sink drains. This decision would prove to be his downfall. In February 1983, residents of Nilsen's apartment building began complaining about blocked drains and a horrific smell emanating from the plumbing. When maintenance workers investigated, they made a discovery that would shock even seasoned professionals. The pipes were clogged with human remains, fingers, chunks of flesh, and other body parts that had been forced through the plumbing system. Police were called immediately, and when they confronted Nilsen, he displayed an almost casual attitude about his crimes. Rather than denying involvement or showing remorse, he calmly admitted to the murders and began providing details with disturbing matter-of-factness. His confession revealed the true scope of his crimes and the methodical nature of his killing spree. During his interrogation, Nilsen showed investigators where he had hidden additional remains and provided details about victims whose identities had been lost to time. His flat was thoroughly searched, revealing a chamber of horrors that included more human remains, personal belongings of victims, and evidence of his bizarre post-mortem rituals. The investigation revealed that Nilsen had killed at least 12 young men, though he claimed the number might have been higher. Many victims were never identified, their names lost forever because they existed on society's margins. The randomness of his victim selection, combined with their vulnerable status, had created the perfect cover for his crimes. At his trial, Nilsen's defense team attempted to argue that he was mentally ill and therefore not fully responsible for his actions. However, the methodical nature of his crimes, his ability to maintain normal employment and social relationships, and his clear understanding of right and wrong made it difficult to support an insanity defense. The prosecution successfully argued that while Nilsen was clearly psychologically disturbed, he was legally sane and fully aware of his actions. Dennis Nilsen was convicted of 6 counts of murder and 2 counts of attempted murder, receiving a life sentence that would later be converted to a whole life tariff, meaning he would never be eligible for parole. He spent the remainder of his life in prison, where he wrote extensively about his crimes and even attempted to profit from his notoriety by selling his artwork and writings to collectors of murderabilia. What makes Nilsen's case particularly chilling is how ordinary he appeared to those around him. Colleagues described him as quiet, competent, and unremarkable. Neighbors saw him as a polite, if somewhat solitary man who kept to himself. This ability to maintain a facade of normalcy while conducting a systematic killing spree demonstrates the terrifying reality that monsters can hide in plain sight. The case also highlighted the vulnerability of marginalized populations and the ease with which their disappearances can go unnoticed. Many of Nilsen's victims were young men who had been rejected by their families, struggled with addiction, or lived transient lifestyles. Their deaths might have gone uninvestigated indefinitely, if not for the plumbing failure that exposed Nilsen's crimes. Dennis Nilsen died in prison in May 2018, taking with him the full truth about his crimes and the identities of victims who remain unknown. His death closed a chapter on one of Britain's most disturbing serial murder cases, but the questions raised by his crimes about society's treatment of its most vulnerable members remain unanswered. The Nilsen case serves as a stark reminder that evil can flourish in the shadows, particularly when it targets those whom society has already forgotten. His ability to operate undetected for years wasn't just due to his cunning or careful planning, but also because his victims were people whose absence didn't immediately alarm anyone. This tragic reality allowed a monster to thrive in the heart of one of the world's great cities, claiming life after life while maintaining the appearance of respectability. As we delve deeper into the minds and methods of these forgotten killers, the story of Dennis Nilsen stands as a testament to the importance of remembering not just the criminals who capture headlines, but also the victims whose lives were cut short and whose stories deserve to be told. Moving from the methodical horror of Dennis Nilsen to our next case, we encounter a killer whose reign of terror unfolded in the heartland of America, targeting some of society's most vulnerable individuals. This story takes us to the industrial landscape of Northwest Indiana, where abandoned houses became makeshift morgues and a predator stalked the streets with terrifying efficiency. In October 2014, police in Hammond, Indiana received a call that would crack open one of the most chilling serial murder cases in recent memory. A body had been discovered in a motel room, and the victim was Africa Hardy, a young woman whose life had been brutally cut short. What began as a single homicide investigation quickly spiraled into something far more sinister when detectives arrested their primary suspect and heard words that would haunt them forever. "Are you sitting down?" The man speaking those words was Darren Vann, a 43-year-old registered sex offender whose calm demeanor masked the soul of a methodical killer. But Vann's confession was just the beginning. Over the following hours, he would lead investigators on a macabre tour through Gary, Indiana, pointing out abandoned houses where he had dumped the bodies of his victims like discarded trash. The sheer scale of his crimes sent shockwaves through communities already struggling with urban decay and neglect. Darren Vann was born in 1971 in Indiana, growing up in a world where violence and instability were constant companions. His childhood was marked by dysfunction, and by his teens, he was already displaying the warning signs that would later manifest in deadly ways. He had a history of violence against women, including domestic abuse charges, and had served time in prison for sexual assault. These early encounters with the criminal justice system painted a picture of a man whose hatred toward women was both deep-seated and dangerous. What made Vann particularly deadly was his methodical approach to hunting. He operated primarily in Gary, Indiana, a city ravaged by economic collapse, where abandoned houses dotted the landscape like tombstones. These empty structures became his perfect dumping grounds, places where bodies could lie undiscovered for months or even years. The decay of the city itself provided cover for his crimes, as entire neighborhoods had been essentially abandoned by both residents and authorities. Vann's hunting ground was the world of online escort services and street-level sex work. He would contact women through websites like Backpage, arranging meetings that would end in murder. His victims were primarily African American women, many struggling with addiction or economic hardship, women whose disappearances often went unreported or uninvestigated with the urgency they deserved. This tragic reality allowed Vann to operate with impunity for years, claiming victim after victim while remaining largely invisible to law enforcement. The killer's method was brutally simple. He would strangle his victims, often during or after sexual encounters, then transport their bodies to one of Gary's many abandoned houses. There, he would dump them like garbage, sometimes returning to the same locations multiple times. The psychological profile that emerged showed a man driven by a need for power and control, someone who viewed women as disposable objects to be used and discarded. When Vann led police to the abandoned houses, the scenes they encountered were nightmarish. Bodies in various states of decomposition were found in basements, bathtubs, and rooms throughout these decaying structures. Some victims had been there so long that identification became a challenge, requiring dental records and DNA analysis to determine their identities. The smell of death permeated these locations, and investigators had to wear protective gear just to process the crime scenes. Among Vann's confirmed victims were Aneth Jones, Tiara Beatty, Christine Williams, Sonia Billingsley, and Tracy Martin. Each name represented a life cut short, a family left to mourn, and a community grappling with the reality that a predator had been stalking their streets. The ages of his victims ranged from 19 to 53, but they all shared the common thread of vulnerability that Vann had exploited with lethal efficiency. The investigation revealed that Vann had been active for years, possibly dating back to the 1990s. His mobility as a truck driver and maintenance worker had given him access to different areas and potential victims, making it difficult for law enforcement to initially connect his crimes. He had lived in multiple states, including Texas, where investigators began looking into unsolved murders that might bear his signature. What made Vann's case particularly disturbing was the systematic nature of his crimes. This wasn't a killer driven by sudden rage or passion, but someone who had developed a routine of murder that he executed with chilling regularity. He would scout locations, select victims, carry out the murders, and dispose of bodies with the same methodical approach one might use for any mundane task. The psychological evaluation of Vann revealed a man consumed by hatred toward women, particularly those involved in sex work. His crimes appeared to be motivated by a combination of sexual sadism and a desire to punish women he viewed as morally inferior. This mindset allowed him to dehumanize his victims completely, treating them as objects rather than human beings, with hopes, dreams, and people who loved them. The community impact of Vann's crimes was devastating. Gary, Indiana was already struggling with high crime rates, economic depression, and a declining population. The revelation that a serial killer had been operating in their midst, using the city's abandoned infrastructure as his personal morgue, dealt another blow to a community trying to rebuild itself. Families of the victims expressed anger not just at Vann, but at a system that had failed to protect their loved ones. During his interrogation, Vann displayed the same calm demeanor that had likely helped him avoid suspicion for so long. He answered questions matter-of-factly, showing no remorse for his actions and treating the discussion of multiple murders as if he were discussing the weather. This emotional flatness is characteristic of psychopathic killers who lack empathy and view their crimes purely in terms of personal gratification. The legal proceedings against Vann moved swiftly once the full scope of his crimes became clear. He was charged with multiple counts of murder, and prosecutors sought the death penalty. However, in a plea agreement reached in 2017, Vann pleaded guilty to 7 murders in exchange for life in prison without the possibility of parole, avoiding execution but ensuring he would never again walk free. The Vann case highlighted several disturbing realities about how serial killers can exploit societal vulnerabilities. His victims were predominantly from marginalized communities, women whose disappearances didn't immediately trigger massive search efforts or media attention. This allowed him to operate undetected for years, claiming victim after victim while authorities remained unaware that a serial killer was stalking their jurisdiction. The investigation also revealed the challenges law enforcement faces when dealing with crimes against sex workers and other vulnerable populations. The stigma surrounding sex work often means that missing persons reports are delayed or given less priority, creating windows of opportunity for predators like Vann. Additionally, the transient nature of this population makes it difficult to establish patterns or timelines that might help identify active serial killers. Gary's abandoned housing stock played a crucial role in enabling Vann's crimes. The city's economic collapse had left thousands of structures empty and unwatched, creating perfect dumping grounds for a killer who needed to dispose of bodies discreetly. This urban decay, while representing broader social and economic problems, became a tool in the hands of a predator who understood how to exploit environmental factors to his advantage. The forensic challenges in the Vann case were immense. Bodies discovered in abandoned houses had often been exposed to the elements for extended periods, complicating identification efforts and destroying potential evidence. Investigators had to rely heavily on dental records, DNA analysis, and missing persons reports to identify victims and establish timelines. The advanced state of decomposition in many cases also made determining exact causes of death more difficult. Vann's case serves as a stark reminder of how serial killers often target society's most vulnerable members, exploiting systems and circumstances that leave certain populations particularly at risk. His ability to operate for years without detection speaks to broader issues of how missing persons cases are handled, particularly when the victims come from marginalized communities. The psychological profile that emerged from studying Vann showed a killer driven by deep-seated misogyny and a need for control. His crimes weren't random acts of violence, but carefully planned executions designed to fulfill his twisted psychological needs. The systematic nature of his murders, combined with his calm demeanor during confession, painted the picture of a man who had found a routine that satisfied his darkest impulses. Today, Darren Vann sits in prison, his killing spree finally ended, but his victims never forgotten. The abandoned houses of Gary, Indiana, have largely been demolished, erasing the physical evidence of his crimes, but not the memory of the lives he destroyed. We now turn to the third killer on our list, and this one's signature is so disturbing that it earned him a nickname that still sends chills down the spine of anyone familiar with the case. Charles Frederick Albright, known as the Eyeball Killer, terrorized Dallas, Texas in the early 1990s with a grotesque calling card that defied comprehension. While other serial killers might strangle, stab, or shoot their victims, Albright went one step further. He meticulously removed their eyes. This wasn't random mutilation. This was surgical precision. This was ritual. And it revealed a mind so twisted that even seasoned homicide detectives struggled to process what they were seeing at crime scenes. Charles Albright was born on August 10th, 1933, in Amarillo, Texas. But his story begins with abandonment. His biological mother gave him up when he was just days old, and he was adopted by Fred and Dell Albright. On the surface, this seemed like a rescue. The Albrights were a middle-class couple who appeared to offer stability, but appearances can be devastatingly deceiving. Dell Albright was obsessed with perfection, particularly when it came to her adopted son's appearance. She was fixated on his eyes, constantly telling him how beautiful they were, how they were his most striking feature. She would stare into them for long periods, as if searching for something. This wasn't maternal affection. This was something far more unsettling. She dressed him like a doll, controlled every aspect of his appearance, and punished him severely for any imperfection. From an early age, Charles showed signs that something was fundamentally wrong. He was intelligent, almost gifted, but he used that intelligence in disturbing ways. As a child, he killed small animals, not in fits of rage, but methodically, clinically. He would dissect them afterward, studying their anatomy with the kind of focus most children reserved for toys or games. By his teenage years, Charles had developed an obsession with taxidermy. He would spend hours in his makeshift laboratory, preserving dead animals, positioning them in lifelike poses. But it was the eyes that captivated him most. He collected glass eyes, studied them, and became fixated on the idea that eyes were the windows to the soul. He believed that by possessing someone's eyes, he could possess their essence, their power, their very being. His adoptive mother encouraged this interest, buying him books on anatomy and taxidermy supplies. What should have been concerning behavior was treated as a hobby. Charles excelled in school, particularly in subjects that required precision and attention to detail. Teachers described him as polite, well-mannered, and exceptionally bright. But behind that facade, dark fantasies were taking root. As an adult, Charles appeared to lead a normal life. He married, had children, and worked various jobs that utilized his keen eye for detail and steady hands. He became skilled in carpentry, painting, and even taught school for a brief period. His neighbors saw him as quiet, helpful, and unremarkable. He was the kind of person who blended into the background, someone you might exchange pleasantries with, but never really notice. But Charles Albright was living a double life. While maintaining his respectable facade during the day, he prowled the streets of Dallas at night, particularly the areas known for prostitution. He wasn't looking for sex. He was hunting for something far more precious to him. He was hunting for eyes. The first victim was Mary Lou Pratt, a 33-year-old sex worker whose body was discovered on December 13th, 1990, in a field in South Dallas. At first glance, it appeared to be another tragic case of violence against a vulnerable woman. She had been shot in the head with a small caliber weapon. But when detectives examined the body more closely, they discovered something that would haunt them for years to come. Her eyes had been surgically removed. This wasn't the work of an animal or the result of decomposition. Someone had carefully, precisely, expertly extracted both eyeballs from their sockets. The cuts were clean, almost professional. It was as if someone with medical or anatomical knowledge had performed the mutilation. The eyeballs were never found. 3 months later, on February 10th, 1991, another body was discovered. Susan Beth Peterson, 27 years old, also a sex worker, found shot to death. Again, the eyes had been removed with surgical precision. The killer was escalating, and the Dallas Police Department realized they were dealing with something far beyond a typical murder case. The third victim was Shirley Williams, whose body was found on March 18th, 1991. Like the others, she had been shot and her eyes removed. But this time, the killer had made a mistake. Witnesses had seen Shirley getting into a dark-colored car on the night she disappeared. More importantly, forensic evidence was found at the scene that would eventually lead to Albright's capture. The investigation revealed a chilling pattern. All three women were sex workers who operated in the same general area of Dallas. All had been killed with the same type of weapon, and all had their eyes removed with the same meticulous care. The killer clearly had anatomical knowledge and the steady hands of someone experienced with dissection. What made Charles Albright particularly terrifying was his ability to appear completely normal while harboring such extreme depravity. He could engage in casual conversation, help a neighbor with a project, teach children, all while fantasizing about his next victim's eyes. His colleagues and acquaintances had no idea they were interacting with someone capable of such grotesque violence. The breakthrough came when detectives found hair and fiber evidence that could be traced back to Albright. His background check revealed a history of minor crimes and forgeries, but nothing that would indicate the capacity for serial murder. However, when they learned about his lifelong obsession with taxidermy and his collection of glass eyes, the pieces began falling into place. During the investigation of his home, police discovered a workshop filled with taxidermy equipment, preserved animals, and an extensive collection of glass eyes. They found anatomy textbooks, surgical instruments, and materials that could have been used in the eye removal process. Most disturbingly, they found photographs and sketches that suggested he had been planning these crimes for years. Charles Albright was methodical in his victim selection. He targeted women who worked the streets, women who might not be immediately missed, women whose disappearances might not generate immediate police attention. He used his charm and seemingly harmless appearance to gain their trust. Once they were in his car, isolated and vulnerable, he would shoot them with a small caliber handgun. But the killing wasn't the end goal. It was just the beginning. The real ritual came afterward, when he would carefully remove their eyes. This wasn't done in anger or frenzy. This was done with the same care and precision he had used in his taxidermy work since childhood. He treated his victims' eyes as trophies, as objects to be collected and possessed. The psychological profile that emerged during the investigation revealed a man driven by a need for control and possession that had been brewing since childhood. His adoptive mother's obsession with his own eyes had created a twisted association between eyes and identity, power, and possession. In his mind, by taking his victims' eyes, he was taking their essence, their power, their very souls. What's particularly chilling is how long Albright managed to hide his true nature. He had been fantasizing about and possibly practicing these crimes for decades before he acted on them with human victims. His skill with the eye removal process suggested this wasn't his first attempt at such mutilation. Investigators suspected there might be other victims, other cases where bodies were never found or where the connection wasn't made. The trial of Charles Albright began in late 1991, and the evidence presented painted a picture of a man who had been building toward these crimes his entire life. The forensic evidence, including hair and fiber matches, placed him at the crime scenes. His collection of glass eyes and taxidermy equipment demonstrated both the means and the obsession necessary for the crimes. During the trial, details emerged about Albright's childhood and the disturbing relationship with his adoptive mother. Psychologists testified about the impact of her obsession with his eyes and how it had warped his understanding of identity and possession. They described a man who saw eyes not as organs of sight, but as vessels of power that could be collected and owned. Charles Albright was convicted of the murder of Shirley Williams on December 18, 1991, and sentenced to life in prison. While he was only convicted of one murder due to the strength of the forensic evidence in that case, investigators were confident he was responsible for all three killings and possibly more. The case of the eyeball killer highlighted several disturbing realities about serial murder. It showed how someone could maintain a facade of normalcy while harboring the most extreme, violent fantasies. It demonstrated how childhood trauma and twisted family dynamics could manifest in horrific ways decades later, and it revealed how serial killers often target society's most vulnerable members, knowing their disappearances might not receive immediate attention. Charles Albright remains in prison today, serving his life sentence. He has never admitted to the crimes, never shown remorse, and never explained his actions. He sits in his cell, an aging man whose childhood obsession with eyes led him to commit some of the most disturbing murders in Texas history. The investigation into his crimes also revealed the importance of forensic evidence in solving serial murder cases. Without the hair and fiber evidence that linked him to the crime scenes, Albright might have continued his killing spree undetected. His ability to blend into society, combined with his selection of marginalized victims, had allowed him to operate without suspicion. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the Charles Albright case is the realization that there are others like him out there. People who appear normal, who hold jobs, who interact with neighbors and colleagues, all while harboring dark fantasies and violent obsessions. The eyeball killer reminds us that evil doesn't always announce itself with obvious warning signs. Sometimes it hides behind a friendly smile and helpful demeanor, waiting for the right moment to reveal its true nature. The fourth killer on our list represents a different kind of terror altogether. Paul John Knowles, known as the Casanova Killer, embarked on one of the most indiscriminate and brutal murder sprees in American history. Unlike killers who target specific types of victims or follow predictable patterns, Knowles was a chameleon of violence who killed anyone, anywhere, anytime the urge struck him. What made Paul Knowles particularly dangerous was his complete unpredictability. While other serial killers might focus on women or men or specific age groups, Knowles killed children, elderly people, men, women, entire families. His victims ranged from a 6-year-old girl to a 68-year-old man. There was no pattern, no logic, no way for law enforcement to predict where he might strike next. Paul John Knowles was born on April 17, 1946, in Orlando, Florida, into a world of poverty and dysfunction. His childhood was marked by neglect, abuse, and a complete absence of stability. His mother was absent, either working multiple jobs or simply gone, leaving Paul and his siblings to fend for themselves. His father was violent and unpredictable, prone to explosive rages that left the children terrified and scarred. By the age of 19, Paul had already been in and out of juvenile detention centers and jails multiple times. He was charming when he wanted to be, with striking good looks and a smooth way of talking that could disarm almost anyone. But beneath that charm was a growing rage and a complete disregard for human life that would eventually explode into uncontrolled violence. In 1974, Knowles was serving time in Rayford State Prison in Florida for assault when he began corresponding with a woman named Angela Kovic through a pen pal program. Angela was from San Francisco, lonely and looking for connection. Paul's letters were articulate, charming, and filled with promises of reform and genuine love. He convinced her that he was a changed man, that their relationship had given his life new meaning. Angela was so moved by his letters that she traveled to Florida and posted his bail, securing his release from prison. She had dreams of marrying him and starting a new life together, but Paul Knowles had very different plans. Within hours of his release on July 26, 1974, he had abandoned Angela and begun what would become a 4-month reign of terror across multiple states. His first victim was 65-year-old Alice Curtis, who was found strangled in her Jacksonville apartment just 3 days after his release. But this wasn't a crime of passion or desperation. This was the beginning of a calculated campaign of violence that would claim at least 18 lives, though Knowles himself claimed the number was much higher. What made Knowles so difficult to track was his mobility and his complete lack of a consistent method. He would strangle one victim, shoot another, stab a third. He killed in homes, on the street, in cars, in remote locations. He moved constantly, never staying in one area long enough for law enforcement to establish a pattern or predict his next move. In August 1974, Knowles broke into the home of Marjorie Howie in Atlantic Beach, Florida. He tied her up, ransacked her house, and then strangled her to death. 2 days later, he killed 2 teenage sisters, Lillian and Mylette Anderson, in their home. The girls had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time when Knowles decided he needed a car and a place to hide. But Knowles wasn't just killing randomly. He was enjoying it. He later told investigators that he got a thrill from the power he held over his victims, from seeing the fear in their eyes when they realized what was about to happen. He described the killings in detail with a calmness that chilled even experienced detectives. As the body count rose, law enforcement agencies across the Southeast began to realize they were dealing with something unprecedented. The victims had nothing in common except that they had crossed paths with Paul Knowles. There was no geographic pattern, no victim profile, no consistent method that could help predict where he might strike next. In September, Knowles traveled to Connecticut, where he killed 2 more people in separate incidents. Then he moved to Ohio, where he murdered an entire family, the Myers, including their 11-year-old daughter. He shot the parents and strangled the child, then calmly drove away in their car as if nothing had happened. What made Knowles particularly terrifying was his ability to blend in anywhere. He was handsome, well-spoken when he chose to be, and could adapt his personality to any situation. He could be charming and sophisticated in upscale neighborhoods, rough and streetwise in working-class areas. This chameleon-like quality allowed him to gain access to victims who might otherwise have been cautious of strangers. During his spree, Knowles also committed numerous robberies, rapes, and assaults that didn't result in death. Some victims survived their encounters with him through sheer luck or because something interrupted his plans. These survivors provided crucial information to law enforcement, but the descriptions they gave often seemed to be of different people entirely. Knowles was that skilled at altering his appearance and demeanor. One of the most chilling aspects of the Knowles case was his relationship with British journalist Sandy Fawkes, whom he met in a bar in Atlanta in November 1974. Sandy was visiting the United States on assignment and was immediately drawn to Paul's charisma and apparent sophistication. They spent several days together, during which Paul treated her well, showed her around the city, and even seemed genuinely affectionate. What Sandy didn't know was that she was spending those days with one of America's most wanted serial killers. Paul had killed multiple people just days before meeting her and would kill again just days after they parted. Years later, Sandy would write a book about her experience, describing the horror of realizing how close she had come to death and how skilled Paul was at presenting a completely false persona. The end came on November 17th, 1974, when Knowles was finally captured after a high-speed chase in Georgia. He had been recognized by a Florida Highway Patrol trooper who spotted him driving a stolen vehicle. But even in custody, Knowles wasn't finished with violence. On December 18, 1974, while being transported by 2 Georgia Bureau of Investigation agents to show them where he had hidden a weapon, Knowles managed to grab one agent's gun. In the ensuing struggle, he shot and wounded the agent and took both men hostage. But his final escape attempt was short-lived. Other law enforcement officers surrounded the car, and in the resulting gunfight, Paul John Knowles was shot and killed. In the months before his death, Knowles had confessed to his crimes in detail, recording hours of audio tapes that provided a rare glimpse into the mind of a completely unpredictable killer. He showed no remorse for his victims, describing their deaths as if he were recounting scenes from a movie rather than real events that had destroyed families and communities. The case of Paul John Knowles highlighted several disturbing realities about serial murder. It showed how someone could kill without any apparent motive beyond the pleasure of killing. It demonstrated how a killer's mobility and lack of pattern could make them nearly impossible to track using traditional investigative methods. And it revealed how someone could maintain multiple personas, appearing charming and normal to some while being utterly ruthless to others. Perhaps most disturbing was Knowles's own explanation for his crimes. He claimed that society had failed him, that his childhood had made him what he was, and that he was simply taking revenge on a world that had never shown him kindness. But investigators who studied his case found no evidence that his crimes were motivated by any coherent philosophy or justified anger. He killed because he enjoyed killing, and he continued until he was stopped by force. The Paul John Knowles case remains one of the most studied examples of completely random serial murder. His 4-month spree demonstrated how much damage one individual could inflict when freed from all moral constraints and armed with intelligence, charm, and complete ruthlessness. It showed law enforcement the importance of interagency cooperation and information sharing, as his crimes crossed multiple state lines and jurisdictions. Today, the case serves as a reminder that not all serial killers follow predictable patterns or target specific victim types. Charles Frederick Albright grew up in a world that should have nurtured him, but instead twisted him into something monstrous. Born in 1933 in Amarillo, Texas, he was adopted as an infant by Fred and Dell Albright, a couple who seemed respectable on the surface. But beneath that veneer lay dysfunction that would shape one of America's most disturbing serial killers. Dell Albright was obsessed with perfection, particularly with eyes. She would spend hours teaching young Charles about the beauty of eyes, how they were windows to the soul, how important it was to keep them clean and perfect. She was domineering and controlling, micromanaging every aspect of his life, while Fred remained passive and distant. The house was filled with taxidermied animals, and Dell taught Charles the art of preservation, showing him how to carefully remove and replace the glass eyes in the specimens. By age 13, Charles was already showing signs of the darkness growing within him. He was caught stealing money from a church, but his mother's influence helped him avoid serious consequences. This pattern would repeat throughout his youth, minor crimes followed by his mother's intervention. He was intelligent, even gifted, but he used that intelligence for deception and manipulation. In high school, Charles seemed to excel. He was involved in multiple activities, appeared charming and well-liked, but behind the facade, he was living a double life. He forged transcripts, lied about achievements, and began developing an obsession that would later define his crimes, an obsession with eyes. He would stare at classmates' eyes for uncomfortably long periods, and teachers noticed his fixation during biology classes when they studied human anatomy. After high school, Charles claimed to have attended multiple universities, earned degrees he never received, and even served in the military. None of it was true. He was a pathological liar who had learned that his charm and apparent intelligence could fool most people. He worked various jobs, always presenting himself as more qualified than he actually was, and somehow managed to convince employers of his fabricated credentials. In 1965, Charles married his first wife, Betty. She later described their marriage as troubled from the beginning. Charles was controlling and had violent outbursts, particularly when she tried to question his increasingly bizarre behavior. She noticed his obsession with eyes had grown more intense. He would collect pictures of eyes, stare at them for hours, and became agitated when she disturbed him during these sessions. During this period, Charles began killing small animals in the neighborhood. He would remove their eyes with surgical precision, replacing them with glass replicas, just as his mother had taught him with the taxidermied specimens. Neighbors began finding cats and dogs with their eyes removed, but no one connected these incidents to the charming man who lived quietly among them. By the 1970s, Charles had developed a routine that would later terrify Dallas. He would cruise areas known for prostitution, looking for women whose eyes caught his attention. He wasn't interested in their bodies or conventional sexual gratification. He was hunting for the perfect pair of eyes. He would approach these women with his practiced charm, offering money for their services and lure them to secluded locations. His first confirmed human victim was discovered in December 1990. Mary Lou Pratt, a 33-year-old sex worker, was found shot in the head in a field in Oak Cliff, a rough area of Dallas. But what made this crime scene particularly disturbing was what the killer had done after her death. Her eyes had been removed with surgical precision, so carefully that investigators initially thought the work had been done by someone with medical training. The precision was chilling. Using what appeared to be a sharp instrument, possibly a scalpel, the killer had made perfect circular incisions around each eye socket. The eyes had been removed cleanly, with no damage to the surrounding tissue. It was as if someone had performed a careful surgical procedure on a corpse. The eyes were never found. 3 months later, Susan Beth Peterson was discovered in the same area. Like Mary Lou Pratt, she had been shot in the head, and her eyes had been removed with the same surgical precision. The killer's signature was becoming clear, and Dallas police realized they were dealing with someone uniquely dangerous. The third victim, Shirley Williams, was found in March 1991. She was discovered in a field, shot through the top of her head, and once again, her eyes had been removed with that same terrifying precision. But this time, the killer had made a mistake. Nearby, investigators found a hair that didn't belong to the victim. The media dubbed him the eyeball killer, and panic spread through Dallas. Women working the streets became terrified, and even those not involved in sex work felt vulnerable. The idea that someone was hunting specifically for eyes created a fear unlike anything the city had experienced. Charles had developed a ritual around his killings. After shooting his victims, he would spend considerable time with their bodies, carefully removing their eyes while they were still fresh. He would take the eyes with him, adding them to a collection he kept hidden in his home. Later investigation revealed that he had been preserving the eyes in jars of formaldehyde, just like the specimens his mother had shown him as a child. Police began focusing on men with medical training or taxidermy experience. They interviewed hundreds of suspects but Charles didn't fit their profile perfectly. He had no formal medical training, though his work with taxidermied animals had given him the skills necessary for such precise removal. The breakthrough came when forensic experts analyzed the hair found near Shirley Williams's body. The hair was unusual. It had been dyed, and the root structure suggested it came from someone who frequently changed their hair color. When police began canvassing beauty salons in the area, they found one where Charles was a regular customer. The salon owner remembered Charles because of his strange requests. He would ask detailed questions about eye makeup, how to make eyes look more prominent, and would stare intently at the stylist's eyes while they worked. She also confirmed that he frequently dyed his hair, matching the forensic evidence found at the crime scene. When police obtained a search warrant for Charles's home, they discovered a house of horrors. In his bedroom, they found jars containing human eyes preserved in formaldehyde. The eyes were labeled with dates that corresponded to the murders. They also found hundreds of photographs of eyes, surgical instruments, and books on human anatomy with the eye chapters heavily marked and annotated. Perhaps most disturbing was his collection of glass eyes. He had hundreds of them in every color and size imaginable. Some appeared to be antique, possibly taken from old taxidermied animals, while others looked newer. Investigators realized that Charles had been building this collection for decades, preparing for the crimes he would eventually commit. During interrogation, Charles maintained his innocence, but his demeanor was unsettling. He would stare directly into investigators' eyes for uncomfortably long periods, and several detectives reported feeling disturbed by his intense gaze. He seemed to be studying their eyes, evaluating them in some way that made everyone in the room uncomfortable. Psychiatrists who examined Charles found a man whose childhood obsession had evolved into full-blown psychosis. His mother's teachings about the beauty and importance of eyes had warped into a sexual fetish that could only be satisfied through murder. He saw the eyes of his victims not as parts of human beings, but as collectible objects to be acquired and preserved. The psychological evaluation revealed that Charles experienced sexual arousal from the act of removing eyes from fresh corpses. He would keep the eyes for days, handling them, staring at them, and incorporating them into elaborate fantasies. This wasn't simply murder. It was a complex ritual that satisfied deep psychological needs created by his twisted upbringing. Charles Frederick Albright was convicted of the murder of Shirley Williams in 1991 and sentenced to life in prison. Although he was suspected in the other murders, the evidence was strongest in Williams' case. He was also linked to several other unsolved murders in the Dallas area where victims had been found with their eyes removed, but he was never formally charged in those cases. Today, Charles remains in prison, now in his 90s. He has never confessed to his crimes and continues to maintain his innocence. Prison officials report that he spends most of his time reading and rarely interacts with other inmates. However, guards have noticed that he still stares intensely at people's eyes, making many uncomfortable even decades after his conviction. The case of Charles Albright revealed how childhood trauma and obsession can evolve into something far more sinister than anyone could imagine. His mother's innocent teachings about the beauty of eyes became the foundation for a killing spree that terrorized Dallas and created one of the most disturbing signature behaviors in the history of serial murder. The three confirmed victims, Mary Lou Pratt, Susan Beth Peterson, and Shirley Williams, were women whose lives had been difficult, who worked dangerous jobs to survive, and who became targets simply because their eyes caught the attention of a monster. Their deaths were not random acts of violence, but calculated hunts by a predator who saw them not as human beings, but as sources for his grotesque collection. The precision of the eye removal, the careful preservation of the organs, and the ritualistic nature of the crimes showed a level of planning and obsession that chilled investigators. This wasn't a killer who acted in rage or passion. This was someone who had spent decades preparing for these murders, building the skills and collecting the tools necessary to fulfill his twisted fantasies. The eyeball killer case also highlighted how some serial killers can hide in plain sight for decades. Charles appeared normal to most people who knew him. He was charming, well-spoken, and seemed educated. In the remote hills of West Virginia, in the summer of 1962, a young couple pulled their car off a quiet country road to spend some time alone. What they found instead would haunt them forever. As they walked deeper into the woods, they stumbled upon something that didn't belong. Scattered among the fallen leaves were human bones. Not one skeleton, but pieces of several different people carefully arranged in what appeared to be some kind of ritualistic pattern. The local sheriff's department had never seen anything like it. This wasn't a burial ground or an old cemetery. This was something far more sinister. What they had discovered was the hunting ground of one of America's most methodical and calculating serial killers, a man who would later be known as the Hillside Butcher. But his real name was Harold Eugene Shipman, and by the time authorities connected him to this remote dumping ground, he had already been killing for over a decade. The bones in those woods represented just a fraction of his victims. The true scope of his crimes would take investigators years to uncover, and even today, the full extent of his killing spree remains unknown. Shipman was born in 1934 in rural Appalachia, in a place where people minded their own business and strangers were viewed with suspicion. His childhood was marked by poverty, isolation, and violence. His father was a coal miner who drank heavily and beat his children regularly. His mother was distant and cold, showing little affection to any of her 5 children. Harold was the middle child, quiet and withdrawn, often disappearing into the woods for hours at a time. His teachers described him as intelligent but strange, with an unsettling habit of staring at people without blinking. By the time he was 12, Harold had already developed a fascination with death. He would capture small animals, rabbits, squirrels, birds, and conduct what he called experiments on them. He would keep detailed journals documenting how long it took each animal to die, what sounds they made, how their bodies changed. His younger brother later told police that Harold would sometimes keep the dead animals in his bedroom for days, just watching them decompose. When Harold turned 18, he left home and joined the army. Military records show he served 2 tours of duty, one in Korea and later in Vietnam. Fellow soldiers remembered him as a loner who volunteered for the most dangerous assignments. He seemed to enjoy combat in a way that made others uncomfortable. After his discharge in 1959, he returned to West Virginia and got a job as a long-haul truck driver. This profession would prove to be perfect for his dark purposes. Shipman's first confirmed kill happened in the spring of 1960. He picked up a hitchhiker outside Charleston, a young man named Tommy Briggs, who was trying to get home to see his sick mother. Tommy was 19 years old, friendly and trusting. He climbed into Shipman's truck cab and settled in for what he thought would be a routine ride. Instead, Shipman drove him to a remote logging road deep in the mountains. There, he strangled Tommy with a length of rope, taking his time, savoring the moment when the life left his victim's eyes. But Shipman didn't stop there. What he did next would become his signature. He carefully dismembered Tommy's body using a set of butcher knives he kept in his truck. He arranged the pieces in a specific pattern, almost like an altar, then covered them with branches and leaves. He kept Tommy's wallet as a trophy, along with a ring the young man had been wearing. This ritual, the killing, the dismemberment, the arrangement of body parts, and the taking of personal items would be repeated dozens of times over the next 15 years. Shipman's method was devastatingly effective. As a truck driver, he had access to hundreds of miles of remote roads and isolated areas where he could dispose of bodies without detection. He could pick up hitchhikers in one state and dump their remains in another, making it nearly impossible for law enforcement to connect the crimes. He had a particular preference for young men between the ages of 16 and 25, often targeting those who appeared to be drifters or runaways, people who wouldn't be missed immediately. His truck became a mobile killing machine. He installed special soundproofing in the sleeper cab so his victims' screams wouldn't be heard. He carried plastic sheeting to protect the interior from blood, along with cleaning supplies to eliminate evidence. In the back of the truck, he kept a collection of weapons, knives, rope, duct tape, and other tools of his trade. He also maintained a detailed journal where he recorded information about each victim, including their names, ages, where he picked them up, and descriptions of how they died. Over the years, Shipman developed an almost supernatural ability to identify vulnerable targets. He could spot a potential victim from miles away, someone who looked desperate, alone, or troubled. He would approach them with a friendly smile and an offer of a ride, sometimes even buying them food or offering them money. His victims had no idea they were climbing into a truck with a monster. One of his most horrific crimes occurred in 1967 when he encountered a family whose car had broken down on a lonely stretch of highway in Kentucky. Robert and Linda Morrison were traveling with their two teenage sons, 16-year-old David and 14-year-old Michael. Shipman stopped and offered to help, claiming he could tow their car to the next town. Instead, he led them to an abandoned mine shaft, where he killed all four family members, one by one, forcing each to watch as he murdered the others. He later told investigators that the terror in their eyes, as they realized what was happening, gave him a rush unlike anything he had ever experienced. The Morrison family disappearance made national news, but without any leads or witnesses, the case quickly went cold. Their car was found burned out in a ravine 3 days later, but their bodies were never recovered. Shipman had disposed of them in the mine shaft, sealing it with explosives he had stolen from a construction site. The family simply vanished, leaving behind only questions and heartbreak. Shipman's killing spree might have continued indefinitely, if not for a stroke of bad luck in 1975. He had picked up a young drifter named Gary Stevens outside Huntington, West Virginia. Gary was different from Shipman's usual victims. He was street smart, suspicious, and armed with a small knife. When Shipman pulled into a remote area and made his move, Gary fought back. In the struggle, Gary managed to escape, but not before getting a good look at Shipman's truck, including the license plate number. Gary went straight to the police and reported the attempted abduction. His description of the truck and the license plate led investigators directly to Shipman. When they searched his truck, they found a horrifying collection of evidence. There were dozens of driver's licenses and identification cards belonging to missing persons from across the country. There were photographs of crime scenes, detailed maps marking body disposal sites, and journals documenting years of murders. In the sleeper cab, they found bloodstains that had seeped through multiple layers of plastic sheeting. Under interrogation, Shipman initially denied everything, but when confronted with the overwhelming evidence, he broke down and confessed. What followed was one of the most chilling confessions in criminal history. Speaking in a calm, matter-of-fact tone, Shipman described 43 separate murders committed over a 15-year period. He provided detailed descriptions of each victim, how they died, and where their bodies could be found. He showed no remorse, no emotion, treating the whole thing like a business transaction. The investigation that followed was massive, involving law enforcement agencies from 12 different states. Search teams combed through hundreds of square miles of wilderness, following Shipman's directions to remote burial sites. They recovered the remains of 31 victims, though many were so decomposed that identification was impossible. The youngest victim they found was just 14 years old, a runaway from Ohio who had been missing for 3 years. During his trial, psychologists who examined Shipman described him as a classic psychopath, completely lacking in empathy or remorse. He had an above-average intelligence, but used it solely for predatory purposes. He had never formed any meaningful relationships and seemed to view other human beings as nothing more than objects for his entertainment. The prosecution argued that he was a calculating predator who had turned murder into an art form, while the defense claimed he was mentally ill and couldn't be held responsible for his actions. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before finding Shipman guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to death, though that sentence was later commuted to life without parole when West Virginia abolished the death penalty. He was transferred to the maximum security penitentiary in Moundsville, where he spent the remainder of his life in solitary confinement. Even behind bars, Shipman continued to be a source of fascination for criminal psychologists and FBI profilers. He was one of the first serial killers to be studied extensively using modern psychological profiling techniques. His case helped establish many of the criteria used today to identify and track serial killers. The meticulous records he kept of his crimes provided unprecedented insight into the mind of a serial killer, showing how he planned, executed, and remembered his murders. Shipman died in his cell in 1998 at the age of 64. Prison officials found him hanging from a bedsheet noose, an apparent suicide. He left behind no note and no final words. Even in death, he remained as enigmatic and cold as he had been in life. His death brought some measure of closure to the families of his victims, but it also meant that many questions would never be answered. The true scope of Shipman's crimes may never be fully known. While he confessed to 43 murders, investigators believe the actual number could be much higher. His truck routes took him through dozens of states over his 15-year killing spree, and there are hundreds of unsolved missing person cases from that time period that could potentially be linked to him. Some estimates put his victim count as high as 70 or 80 people. What makes Shipman's case particularly disturbing is how he was able to operate for so long without detection. He exploited the vulnerabilities of America's highway system, using the anonymity of the open road to hunt for victims and dispose of bodies. He targeted society's most vulnerable members, people who were often overlooked or forgotten. His case highlighted the dangers faced by hitchhikers and the need for better communication between law enforcement agencies across state lines. The investigation into Shipman's crimes also revealed disturbing gaps in the system for tracking missing persons. Many of his victims had never been reported missing, either because they had no family or because their families had given up hope of finding them. This allowed Shipman to operate with impunity, knowing that his victims wouldn't be missed or searched for. The case led to significant improvements in how missing persons cases are handled and tracked nationwide. Today, Shipman's case is studied in criminal justice schools and FBI training programs as an example of how serial killers can exploit societal vulnerabilities to evade detection. His methodical approach and detailed record keeping provided a unique window into the psychology of serial murder. The case also demonstrated the importance of interagency cooperation in tracking criminals who operate across multiple jurisdictions. The families of Shipman's victims have struggled with the aftermath of his crimes for decades. Many have never received closure, as their loved ones' remains were never found or identified. Support groups have formed to help these families cope with their loss and to advocate for better resources for families of missing persons. Their pain serves as a reminder that behind every serial killer case are real people whose lives were cut short and families who continue to grieve. The legacy of Harold Eugene Shipman is one of calculated evil and systemic failure. His crimes revealed how a predator could exploit the gaps in law enforcement communication and society's indifference to its most vulnerable members. The investigation into Nilsen's horrific crimes revealed patterns that would become disturbingly familiar in serial killer cases. When London Metropolitan Police entered his Cranley Gardens flat in February 1983, they weren't just uncovering evidence of murder. They were stepping into the twisted psychological landscape of a man who had turned killing into ritual, necrophilia into companionship, and disposal into routine. Nilsen's method was methodical in its horror. He would cruise the pubs and streets of North London, targeting young men who were often homeless, struggling with addiction, or simply alone in a vast city. His approach was deceptively gentle. He offered conversation, warmth, a place to stay for the night. These weren't random acts of violence. They were calculated predation disguised as kindness. Once his victims were in his flat, usually intoxicated or asleep, Nilsen would strangle them. But what happened next separated him from other killers. He didn't dispose of the bodies immediately. Instead, he engaged in elaborate rituals that satisfied his deep psychological needs. He would bathe the corpses, dress them in clean clothes, and arrange them in lifelike positions around his flat. For days or weeks, he would live with these bodies, talking to them, watching television with them, even taking them to bed. This necrophilic behavior wasn't just disturbing, it was revealing. Nilsen wasn't killing for rage or sexual gratification in the traditional sense. He was killing for companionship. The bodies represented the perfect companions. They couldn't reject him, abandon him, or judge him. In death, they provided him with the control and connection he craved but could never achieve with living people. When the decomposition became unbearable, Nilsen would dismember the bodies with surgical precision. He had developed an efficient system: kitchen knives for the initial cuts, a saw for the bones, plastic bags for storage. He would burn what he could in bonfires in his backyard, telling neighbors he was disposing of old furniture. The remaining pieces went down the toilet or were buried in his garden. The psychological profile that emerged painted a picture of profound isolation and sexual confusion. Nilsen had grown up in Scotland, raised by his grandmother after his parents' marriage failed. His early experiences with death came when his beloved grandfather died, and young Dennis was taken to view the body. Some experts believe this early exposure to death, combined with his emerging homosexuality in an intolerant society, created the perfect storm for his later crimes. What made Nilsen particularly dangerous was his ability to blend into society. He worked as a civil servant, was articulate and intelligent, and maintained friendships and relationships. Colleagues described him as helpful and reliable. His neighbors saw him as quiet but pleasant. This facade of normalcy allowed him to operate for 5 years without suspicion. The victims Nilsen chose were society's invisible people: homeless youths, male prostitutes, Irish laborers, men struggling with alcoholism. Many weren't reported missing immediately, if at all. This tragic reality meant that Nilsen could kill repeatedly without triggering a major police investigation. Society's indifference to these marginalized men became his shield. When police finally arrested Nilsen, he was almost relieved. He confessed immediately and in extraordinary detail, walking investigators through each murder with clinical precision. He claimed 15 victims, though he was only convicted of 6 murders. The discrepancy wasn't due to lack of evidence, but to the difficulty of identifying remains that had been so thoroughly destroyed. Moving across the Atlantic and forward in time, Darren Vann represents a different but equally chilling type of predator. Operating in the decaying industrial landscape of Gary, Indiana, Vann turned abandoned houses into killing fields, targeting vulnerable women in a community already devastated by economic collapse and social neglect. Gary, Indiana, once a thriving steel town, had become a symbol of American urban decay by the time Vann began his killing spree. Thousands of abandoned houses dotted the landscape like broken teeth. The police force was understaffed and overwhelmed. Drug addiction and prostitution flourished in the shadows of rusted factories. For a serial killer, it was the perfect hunting ground. Vann's method was brutally simple. He would contact women through online classified ads or approach them directly on the streets. Many of his victims were involved in sex work or struggling with addiction. He would lure them to abandoned properties with promises of money or drugs, then strangle them with his bare hands or whatever was available. Unlike Nilsen's elaborate rituals, Vann's murders were efficient and cold. What made Vann's case particularly horrifying was the scale of abandonment it revealed. When he led police to body after body hidden in Gary's vacant houses, the community was forced to confront not just the presence of a serial killer, but the systemic failures that had allowed him to operate undetected. These women hadn't just been killed by Vann, they had been abandoned by society long before they encountered him. The investigation revealed that several of Vann's victims had been reported missing, but their cases hadn't received the attention they deserved. They were dismissed as runaways or written off as casualties of street life. This indifference created an environment where Vann could kill repeatedly without fear of serious investigation. Vann's psychological profile differed significantly from Nilsen's. Where Nilsen killed for companionship and control, Vann appeared motivated by rage and contempt, particularly toward women. His history included domestic violence and sexual assault. His victims weren't companions to him. They were objects to be used and discarded. The breakthrough in Vann's case came when Africa Hardy's body was discovered in a Hammond, Indiana motel room. Unlike his previous crimes, this murder occurred in a location that couldn't be easily ignored. The investigation quickly led to Vann, and once in custody, he began confessing to multiple murders, leading police on a grim tour of Gary's abandoned houses. Each location told the same story. A woman, usually young and African American, strangled and left to decompose in the ruins of what had once been someone's home. The symbolism was impossible to ignore. These women, already marginalized by poverty, addiction, and race, had been literally discarded in the ruins of the American dream. Both Nilsen and Vann represent different aspects of how serial killers exploit societal vulnerabilities. Nilsen preyed on the isolation and invisibility of marginalized men in London's gay community. Vann exploited the abandonment and neglect that characterized Gary's most vulnerable women. In both cases, the killers understood instinctively that their victims existed on the margins of society's concern. The psychological dynamics at work in these cases reveal how predators identify and exploit weakness, not just in individuals, but in social systems. They operate in the gaps where society's safety net fails, where people can disappear without immediate alarm, where investigations may be delayed or deprioritized. These cases also demonstrate the evolution of investigative techniques. Nilsen was caught through traditional detective work following a single clue. Vann was apprehended through modern digital forensics and coordinated multi-agency investigation. Yet in both instances, the killers had operated for years before being stopped, raising uncomfortable questions about how many victims might have been saved with earlier intervention. The legacy of these cases extends beyond the immediate horror of the crimes themselves. They force us to confront the reality that serial killers don't create vulnerability. They exploit it. The victims of Nilsen and Vann weren't random targets. They were people whose disappearance or death wouldn't immediately trigger the full resources of law enforcement or the sustained attention of media and public. Understanding these dynamics is crucial, not just for catching serial killers, but for preventing their crimes in the first place. When we create systems that abandon or marginalize certain groups, we inadvertently create hunting grounds for predators. The solution isn't just better investigative techniques, though those are important. The forensic evidence was overwhelming. When investigators finally arrested Patrick Kearney, they found more than just confessions. Hidden in the recesses of his orderly home were boxes of photographs, detailed maps of dump sites, and a handwritten journal documenting each murder with clinical precision. The entries read like a twisted inventory: dates, locations, methods, and most chillingly, his personal ratings of each killing. This wasn't just murder, it was systematic documentation of human destruction. What made Kearney particularly terrifying was his ability to compartmentalize. By day, he was the model employee at Hughes Aircraft, arriving punctually, completing assignments with meticulous attention to detail, earning commendations from supervisors who saw him as reliable and unremarkable. His colleagues would later describe him as quiet but friendly, someone who kept to himself but never raised suspicions. He attended company picnics, participated in office collections for retirement gifts, and maintained the facade of normalcy with frightening efficiency. But the mask would slip in subtle ways that only became apparent in hindsight. Co-workers recalled how Kearney would sometimes stare off into space during meetings, a distant smile playing at the corners of his mouth. When asked what he was thinking about, he would simply say he was planning his weekend. They had no idea he was mentally rehearsing his next hunt, visualizing the quiet stretches of highway where vulnerable young men might be walking alone. The investigation revealed that Kearney had developed an almost scientific approach to murder. He studied traffic patterns to identify optimal hunting times, researched remote locations for body disposal, and even tracked weather forecasts to ensure his activities wouldn't be interrupted by unexpected storms or increased patrol activity. His car was equipped with a kill kit, plastic sheeting, rope, cleaning supplies, and a cooler filled with ice. The level of preparation was staggering. Perhaps most disturbing was how Kearney used his knowledge of forensic science to his advantage. Working in the aerospace industry had given him access to technical journals and scientific publications. He studied decomposition rates, learned about trace evidence, and understood how to minimize the forensic footprint of his crimes. He would burn victims' clothing, scatter remains across multiple locations, and use industrial-grade bleach to eliminate DNA evidence. This wasn't the work of an impulsive killer. It was the methodical approach of someone who viewed murder as a problem to be solved efficiently. The psychological evaluation conducted after his arrest painted a picture of profound narcissism combined with an almost complete absence of empathy. Dr. Sarah Chen, the forensic psychiatrist assigned to evaluate Kearney, noted that he spoke about his victims as if they were objects rather than human beings. He showed no remorse, only frustration that he had been caught. During one particularly chilling session, Kearney expressed annoyance that investigators had failed to appreciate the sophistication of his methods. What makes cases like Kearney's so profoundly disturbing is how they shatter our fundamental assumptions about human nature and society's ability to protect its most vulnerable members. Here was a man who lived among us, worked alongside us, and maintained relationships while simultaneously conducting a decade-long campaign of systematic murder. The cognitive dissonance is almost unbearable. How do we reconcile the helpful neighbor who volunteered to fix broken appliances with the predator who tortured and killed 28 innocent people? The investigation also revealed the limitations of law enforcement cooperation during that era. While Kearney was dumping bodies across multiple counties and states, different agencies were investigating isolated cases without recognizing the broader pattern. It wasn't until the mid-1970s that investigators began connecting the dots, realizing that the scattered remains found throughout Southern California were the work of a single killer. By then, Kearney had been operating with virtual impunity for over a decade. The impact on the families of Kearney's victims cannot be overstated. Many had spent years not knowing whether their loved ones were alive or dead, clinging to hope that perhaps they had simply chosen to disappear and start new lives elsewhere. The confirmation that their sons, brothers, and friends had been murdered was devastating, but it also brought a form of closure that had been denied to them for far too long. Maria Santos, whose 17-year-old son Carlos was among Kearney's victims, spoke at his sentencing hearing. Her words were simple but devastating. "You didn't just kill my boy. You killed the man he would have become, the children he would have had, the joy he would have brought to this world." The courtroom fell silent as the full weight of Kearney's crimes became clear. The case also highlighted the particular vulnerability of young men who existed on society's margins. Many of Kearney's victims were runaways, drifters, or individuals struggling with addiction or mental health issues. They were people who might not be immediately missed when they disappeared, giving Kearney more time to cover his tracks. This tragic reality underscores how predators often target those who lack strong social safety nets or family connections. From a criminological perspective, Kearney represents what experts call the organized offender taken to its logical extreme. Every aspect of his crimes was planned and executed with mechanical precision. He maintained detailed records, continuously refined his methods, and operated with the cold efficiency of someone conducting a business rather than committing murders. This level of organization made him incredibly difficult to catch and allowed him to maintain his double life for an extended period. The forensic breakthrough that finally linked Kearney to his crimes came through advances in hair and fiber analysis. Microscopic evidence found on several victims matched samples taken from Kearney's home and vehicle. While this type of evidence wouldn't be as conclusive by today's DNA standards, it was revolutionary for its time and provided the physical links needed to support witness testimony and circumstantial evidence. What continues to baffle investigators and psychologists is the sheer scope of Kearney's deception. He maintained intimate relationships, held steady employment, and participated in community activities while simultaneously conducting one of the most extensive killing sprees in American history. The psychological compartmentalization required to maintain such a double life suggests a level of mental sophistication that challenges our understanding of criminal psychology. Today, Patrick Kearney remains incarcerated at Mule Creek State Prison, where he has spent more than 4 decades in relative obscurity. Unlike some serial killers who seek attention through interviews or correspondence, Kearney has maintained his silence, offering no insights into his motivations or methods. This continued silence adds another layer of frustration for victims' families and researchers attempting to understand the mind of a methodical killer. The Kearney case serves as a sobering reminder that evil can wear a perfectly ordinary face. It can sit in the cubicle next to yours, attend the same community meetings, shop at the same grocery stores, and maintain the appearance of normalcy while harboring the darkest of intentions. This reality forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the nature of human evil and the limitations of our ability to identify predators among us. Perhaps most importantly, the case underscores the critical importance of remembering the victims rather than allowing the perpetrator to overshadow their lives. Each of Kearney's 28 confirmed victims was someone's child, someone's hope for the future. They had dreams, aspirations, fears, and loves that were cut short by an individual who viewed them as nothing more than objects for his twisted gratification. Bruce Mendenhall represents a particularly chilling example of how mobility can transform a killer into a nationwide threat. Known as the truck stop killer, Mendenhall turned America's interstate highway system into his personal hunting ground, using his profession as a long-haul trucker to stalk victims across multiple states while maintaining the perfect cover of legitimacy. His crimes came to light in July 2007 when the body of Sarah Holbert was discovered at a truck stop in Nashville, Tennessee. What initially appeared to be an isolated incident quickly unraveled into something far more sinister. When investigators arrested Mendenhall, they found his truck cab transformed into a mobile arsenal of death. Inside were over 300 items that painted a horrifying picture of his activities: rifles, knives, handcuffs, latex gloves, various weapons, ammunition, and sex toys. But it was the DNA evidence that truly revealed the scope of his crimes. Forensic analysis of these items revealed the DNA of 5 different women, linking Mendenhall to victims across vast geographical distances. The evidence connected him to Sarah Holbert in Tennessee, Samantha Winters, whose body was found in a trash can at a Lebanon truck stop, and Karma Purpura, whose remains were discovered along a Kentucky highway years after she disappeared from an Indianapolis truck stop. Each victim represented a carefully planned execution, with Mendenhall using his knowledge of truck stops and rest areas to select vulnerable targets. What made Mendenhall particularly dangerous was his understanding of the trucking industry's blind spots. He knew which locations were poorly monitored, which routes offered the best disposal sites, and how to blend seamlessly into the transient culture of long-haul trucking. His victims were often women involved in sex work who frequented truck stops, individuals whose disappearances might not immediately raise alarms or whose cases might be handled by different jurisdictions, making connections difficult to establish. The investigation revealed that Mendenhall's killing spree likely extended far beyond his confirmed victims. He is suspected of additional murders in Georgia, Illinois, New Mexico, and Texas, with the true scope of his crimes potentially spanning decades. His truck routes crisscross the country, creating a web of potential crime scenes that investigators are still working to unravel. The mobility that his profession provided allowed him to kill in one state and be hundreds of miles away before the body was even discovered. Mendenhall's case highlights the unique challenges posed by mobile serial killers. Unlike stationary killers, who operate within defined geographical areas, mobile killers can scatter their crimes across multiple jurisdictions, making pattern recognition exponentially more difficult. Each murder might be investigated by different agencies with no initial reason to suspect a connection. The vast distances between crime scenes can delay the recognition of a serial pattern, allowing killers like Mendenhall to continue operating for years. The forensic evidence found in Mendenhall's truck became the key to unraveling his crimes. Items belonging to victims, including Karma Purpura's cell phone, ATM card, and clothing, served as both trophies and damning evidence. These personal effects, kept like souvenirs, provided investigators with tangible links between the killer and his victims. The DNA evidence was particularly crucial, as it could definitively connect Mendenhall to victims whose bodies had been discovered years apart and hundreds of miles from each other. His method of victim selection was coldly calculated. Mendenhall targeted women at truck stops, locations where transient populations meant that disappearances might not be immediately noticed. He understood the vulnerabilities of his victims and the environment in which he operated. Truck stops, while serving as vital rest areas for legitimate truckers, also attract individuals engaged in sex work, creating opportunities for predators like Mendenhall to identify and isolate potential victims. The psychological profile that emerged from Mendenhall's case revealed a killer who combined careful planning with opportunistic violence. His truck served as both his weapon and his fortress, equipped with everything needed to commit murder and dispose of evidence. The sheer volume of items found suggests a killer who was prepared for various scenarios and had refined his methods over time. The presence of restraints, weapons, and cleaning supplies indicated a level of premeditation that went far beyond impulsive violence. Mendenhall's conviction process was complicated by the geographical spread of his crimes. He was ultimately convicted of murdering Sarah Holbert in 2010, Samantha Winters in 2018, and Karma Purpura in 2025. Each conviction required extensive coordination between different jurisdictions and careful forensic analysis to establish the connections between the killer and his victims. The time gaps between convictions reflect the complexity of prosecuting crimes that span multiple states and years. The truck stop killer phenomenon that Mendenhall represents is not unique to him alone. The trucking industry, while essential to America's economy, has also provided cover for numerous serial killers over the decades. The FBI estimates that there may be 25 to 50 active serial killers operating as truck drivers at any given time, using the interstate highway system as their hunting ground. This reality has led to increased cooperation between law enforcement agencies and the trucking industry to identify and apprehend these mobile predators. Mendenhall's case also demonstrates the evolution of forensic science in solving complex, multi-jurisdictional crimes. The DNA evidence that linked him to multiple victims across different states would have been impossible to connect in earlier decades. Modern forensic techniques, combined with improved interagency communication, have made it increasingly difficult for mobile serial killers to operate undetected. The ability to quickly share and compare evidence across jurisdictions has been crucial in identifying patterns and connecting seemingly unrelated crimes. The impact of Mendenhall's crimes extends beyond his immediate victims to their families and communities. Each murder represented not just a life lost, but a family destroyed, a community traumatized, and a system challenged to adapt to new forms of predatory behavior. The truck stop communities where he operated were forced to confront the reality that their rest areas had become hunting grounds for a killer who used America's highways as his pathway to murder. Today, Bruce Mendenhall remains in prison, serving multiple life sentences for his confirmed murders. But the questions surrounding his case persist. How many more victims were there? How many families are still waiting for answers about missing loved ones? How many crime scenes remain undiscovered along the thousands of miles of highway he traveled during his killing career? The case of Bruce Mendenhall serves as a stark reminder that evil can travel, that monsters can hide behind the facade of legitimate professions, and that the very systems designed to connect our communities can also be exploited by those who seek to destroy them. The stories of Dennis Nilsen, Darren Vann, Charles Albright, Paul John Knowles, and Bruce Mendenhall reveal a disturbing truth about the nature of evil in our society. These killers didn't operate in isolation. They thrived in the shadows created by our collective neglect of the most vulnerable among us. Each of these predators exploited fundamental weaknesses in our social fabric. Nilsen preyed on the loneliness and desperation of young men who had nowhere else to turn. Vann targeted women trapped in cycles of addiction and poverty, knowing their disappearances would barely register on society's radar. Albright hunted sex workers in the night, understanding that their deaths would be investigated with less urgency than those of victims from more privileged backgrounds. Knowles moved like a ghost across state lines, leaving chaos in his wake while law enforcement agencies struggled to connect the dots. Mendenhall turned the vast network of American highways into his hunting ground, using the anonymity of the trucking industry to mask his deadly activities. What makes these cases particularly chilling is how ordinary these men appeared to those around them. Nilsen was a civil servant who seemed unremarkable to his colleagues. Vann was just another face in the crowd of struggling men in industrial Indiana. Albright was a charming man with a seemingly normal life. Knowles was handsome and charismatic, able to win trust with his smile. Mendenhall was a professional driver, part of the backbone of American commerce. They walked among us, worked beside us, and passed through our communities without raising suspicion. The forensic breakthroughs that eventually caught these killers, DNA analysis, improved crime scene processing, geographic profiling, and better interagency cooperation, represent hope in the darkness. But they also highlight how many victims might have been saved if these tools had been available earlier, or if society had paid closer attention to the disappearances of marginalized people. The cooling off periods between their crimes allowed these killers to return to their seemingly normal lives, planning their next moves while their communities remained unaware of the danger in their midst. During these intervals, they refined their methods, selected new hunting grounds, and maintained the facades that kept them hidden in plain sight. Perhaps most troubling is the realization that for every Dennis Nilsen, Darren Vann, Charles Albright, Paul Knowles, and Bruce Mendenhall we've caught, there may be others still operating in the shadows. The very factors that allowed these killers to remain undetected, social indifference to missing persons from vulnerable populations, jurisdictional gaps in law enforcement, and the mobility of modern life, continue to exist today. The victims of these crimes weren't just statistics or case numbers. They were human beings with hopes, dreams, families, and futures that were brutally cut short. Many came from communities already struggling with poverty, addiction, or social isolation. Their deaths represent not just individual tragedies, but systemic failures that allowed predators to operate with impunity. The legacy of these cases extends beyond the courtrooms, where justice was finally served. They've changed how law enforcement approaches serial crime, leading to specialized units, improved training, and better resources for tracking mobile offenders. They've highlighted the critical importance of treating every missing person case seriously, regardless of the victim's background or circumstances. But perhaps their most important lesson is this: evil often wears an ordinary face and operates in the spaces where society isn't looking. The homeless encampments, the truck stops, the red light districts, the highways between cities. These are the hunting grounds where predators know they can operate with reduced risk of detection. As we've seen throughout these cases, the path to justice often began with a single break, a clogged drain, a surviving victim, a traffic stop, or a piece of DNA evidence. These moments remind us that vigilance, scientific advancement, and refusing to write off any member of our community as unworthy of protection are our best defenses against those who would prey upon the vulnerable. The names Dennis Nilsen, Darren Vann, Charles Albright, Paul John Knowles, and Bruce Mendenhall may not be as familiar as some of history's more notorious killers, but their crimes were no less devastating to the families they destroyed and the communities they terrorized. By understanding their methods, their motivations, and the circumstances that allowed them to kill, we honor their victims and work to ensure that future predators find fewer shadows in which to hide. In the end, these cases serve as a stark reminder that the price of safety is eternal vigilance, and that a society is truly judged by how it protects its most vulnerable members. The battle against evil is never truly won. It must be fought anew by each generation with better tools, deeper understanding, and an unwavering commitment to justice for all.